So I imagine that all of us have had, we've all experienced the moment where you've walked up on a conversation, maybe caught just kind of a snippet of what they were talking about. Maybe it was just the tail end of a conversation, and you didn't hear everything they said, but you heard just enough, and you got really mad about it. You got angry, and only to realize a little bit later that it's not actually what they meant at all. As a matter of fact, you just didn't hear everything. You heard the right words, but you didn't hear all of the words, and so you kind of missed what they were saying, and it wasn't even worth arguing about. It wasn't even something to get mad about, and yet you did, and it's because your response was very real, even though your assumptions were very wrong, right? Anybody? No, just me? You see, here's what happened in that moment. You heard what was said, but you heard it out of context. And we've all heard this before. We know what we're talking about here. You heard the right words. You heard the right words, but you didn't hear all of the words. And so you missed all of the point of what they were really trying to say. And so as we all know, context matters. We've heard this before. This is not news. Context matters. Context. And it's not just the words that get said. We know that's true. That's not all there is to communication. There's also, kind of where they were when it got said, who they were talking to when it got said, everything that God said. Did you hear the whole story? Did you hear the rest of the story? How they said it, their tone and their inflection, all of those things matter. Do you have all of the information is really the question in order for it to not be out of context. You see, if you don't have all of the information, then you may miss the point. You may miss the meaning because you don't have all of the information. You've got a little bit, but you don't have it all. And we've all experienced this to some degree. I mean, especially in the world of, texting and emails that we live in nowadays. Isn't that true? I mean, it just is so easy. You're typing a message and, maybe you accidentally leave out a word or a couple of words, maybe some punctuation or our favorite, autocorrect steps in and like auto destroys the conversation because all of a sudden you look back and you read your text and you're like, oh man, that makes zero sense. Or I just cussed in my text and I didn't mean to. And it doesn't matter because that's what gets communicated and translated, and it can distort it. It distorts what you were actually meaning, what you were actually trying to say. It doesn't make any sense. So let me give you a quick example of when this has actually happened to me, and this is just one of a bajillion stories, but this was actually a text message between, a real, actual text message. I went back and I had to find, this was just a few weeks ago, between my wife, Rebecca, and I. And so we were exchanging these messages, and these are actual text messages, by the way. And so my daughter's now fiance, he wasn't at the time, but now he is. He had come to my office to talk about, asking me to, allow him to marry his daughter. It was that kind of formal thing, and I appreciated that because, he better have. But he did, and so we were at my office, and we were talking and chatting, and here's the thing, we were trying to be sneaky so that Mary Fran, didn't know what was going on. It's supposed to be a surprise and all that, and so I knew that much, but, we're in a real conversation, so I'm kind of in serious mode a little bit, and my wife is just sometimes on a different wavelength than me. and so there are occasions, it's not often, but there are occasions where what is happening in her mind and is clear to her isn't always clear to me. And even though it makes total sense, I just am not quite there yet, and I haven't caught up. And so in the middle of our conversation, so we're at you got the picture, right? So that's the context of what's going on. You understand what's going on a little bit. And so she texts me this message, okay? So this is the actual message. Let me read it to you because it's kind of small. I need you to text me when he leaves your office so it's not from his phone. Now, again, I'm not always certain that I understand what's going on in her mind, and I know that up front, but I knew we were trying to be kind of sneaky, and so I assumed like this was related, like this was somehow part of that, and so I didn't know, like, I just kind of went with it. I said, okay. Well, then she writes back, and she says, Leroy and I are done as good. Just like that. No punctuation, no context. Leroy and I are done as good. So I proceeded to politely ask, what? Anybody ever written that exact word? What? So she clears things up for me. And she says, say that. Now, that's the last word I got out because I didn't actually catch the rest. I didn't understand. She just said, say that. And she followed it up, to give it more clarification in case she's looking at my phone. And I think it finally became obvious to her that I wasn't quite following. I didn't know what she was talking about because Grady and I were still talking, like we were having a conversation. And I just was like, what? I don't understand. What are you talking about? And so she brings all the clarity in the world to it because this was the last part of the text. ... And it looked just like that. Now, I finally figured this out, but I think we actually had to have a phone conversation in order for me to understand. Oh, I get it. Like, I'm supposed to text from my phone as if it's Grady, I think. Or no. I'm supposed to text her. I'm still not exactly sure like what this was supposed to look like, but I think this was somehow in her mind to give it space on her text thread so that if she saw her phone, she couldn't see the rest of this. You see, it doesn't make sense out of context, and we've all experienced this on some level, to some degree, right? I mean, we all know what this is like. Even when you know each other really well, it's sometimes hard to tell. It's like, I'm not in your head, I don't know what's going on. But this is true also just of things that you thought you already knew, things that you've always known, things that have been quoted, familiar quotes that we've heard all our lives. We thought we knew all about it, and yet we didn't. Let me give you a really familiar one, okay? You ready? This is from an old poem, okay? I didn't write it. Let me see if you can finish the sentence, okay? Oh, Romeo, Romeo. Yeah. Wherefore art thou Romeo? Now, I'm sure I'm the only one that always thought, anytime I heard this, that what I envisioned was, Juliet walking around in the garden saying, Romeo, where are you? That was just my thought. Matter of fact, I was 46 years old before I realized that was not the case. And I'm 46. Did you actually know that wherefore means why? Now, we don't say that, but actually it's Romeo, Romeo, why are you Romeo? In other words, and the only way you don't even have to know that word means why, if you actually read this in context. In other words, if you see the immediate line after this, you can begin to put the pieces together. This is what context does for you. These are called context clues. Deny thy father, refuse thy name. The whole problem was that they couldn't be together and love one another because their families were always fighting one another. They hated one another. And so it just made sense to her that if your name just wasn't Romeo, but you were still you, then we could be together. So just deny your name. Everything would be okay. If it's just your name that's the problem. That's really what she's saying, which is the point of her entire monologue. But you don't know that until you read this in context. And this happens all the time, and those are kind of, cute, funny examples or whatever. But the truth is, and we all know this, we all experience this, we all know that this can be extremely dangerous as well. That it can be very dangerous and volatile and very costly to get things out of context. I mean, isn't it true? We've watched politicians lose elections because of something they said 30 years ago in a speech that somebody pulled out, put into paper, and made public. They took it out of context. It's like, well, it just didn't matter. We've seen marriages fall apart and friendships come to an end. We've experienced this ourselves. Maybe even the loss of a job because of something that was spoken, something that was said, something that was typed, something that was written, texted, emailed, whatever. Something that was communicated, but then miscommunicated because it was taken somehow out of context. There was miscommunication and therefore misinterpretation. And the whole point was missed, and we see the devastating effect of something so simple. That's why this is so potentially dangerous, which is really the point of our series, Context. It's really what I want to talk about today and over the next few weeks, because when it comes to our Bible, when it comes to Scripture, the same truth applies, that context actually does matter. And we see this all the time. We have, we take verses, separate verses and individual verses, and I feel like there's a little bit of a hum, like a scotchy of a hum. That's my word, scotchy. Don't take that out of context. But it's, we take a verse or even a piece of verse and we put them on mugs and t-shirts and, on a plaque to put over the fireplace and, And all of that's fine, or we post it on Facebook and Instagram in order to encourage somebody and to inspire somebody, or maybe just us that's in a particular, circumstance or situation. And here's the thing, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, walking around with a verse on your t-shirt or on a bumper sticker somewhere. That's not wrong. It's just, are we aware of the potential danger if we take that out of context and it distorts a little bit the truth of what's actually being communicated and actually what is said. See, here's the danger. Here's some of the dangers of what potentially happens when you take Scripture out of context, out of its context, and you don't understand, everything about it to its fullest extent, at least what's possible. This is the potential. When you take it out of context, it can trivialize our faith. In other words, the inspired Word of God just becomes a book full of, kind of random, cute little anecdotes, little, sayings and quotes that we like and that encourage us and inspire us. That's all we kind of use Scripture the way that we want to use it, when we want to use it. That's kind of what it can happen. And when that happens, this can happen. It begins to shrink our perception of God. God kind of becomes this, at least there's potential for this pocket-sized God that we take out on occasion when it's useful, when it's helpful. But then, when he says something we don't like, we just put it back. It's no big deal. There's potential for that, which can ultimately lead to this. It creates false expectations. And you see this all the time. This may represent some of you watching or some of you here today. You see this all the time in people who are exploring faith or are new to faith. And you see this happen with them because, they hear all the time that what God is going to do for them and how incredible God's grace and His goodness and His love and His mercy are. And we hear about it. God knows His plans for you, plans to give you a hope in a future. And God is going to, if you just come to God and you pray in the name of Jesus, He's going to give you whatever you asked for in His name. And if you'll just do that, then everything's going to be okay, but then things aren't okay. At least those are the expectations that we've created. Life doesn't work out quite the way we thought. And so as our expectations aren't met, we begin to have doubt, questions, and concerns. We just I don't really know. And here's a potential danger as well. When we take it out of context, it can actually be used to justify sin. You've seen this happen before. You've heard people that walk around and it's like, no. Doesn't the Bible say? That's what you hear people say. Maybe you've said that. Excuse me, that's not what my Bible says. We hear people say, well, doesn't the Bible say eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? Like, I can do that, right? What's the big deal? I can get back. I can take revenge. Doesn't the Bible say, don't tell me how to live? Doesn't the Bible say, that God's going to give me, whatever I want and that it's okay and that, I can live how I want and do what I want because He's going to give me mercy and grace and it's boundless and it's endless and He's going to forgive me anyway? Don't tell me how to live. Don't judge me. Doesn't the Bible say, judge not, lest you be judged? Doesn't the Bible say that? It's like, well, gosh, kind of, but you're taking it out of context, what we want to say. But we do it all the time. We do it ourselves. We, pick and choose the parts that we like, and we use them to make our arguments and to make our points and to prove our stance on a particular something, a particular issue. That's why this matters so much. It's not wrong to memorize a verse that represents something, a particular something, as long as you understand what's all around it and what the real truth is behind it. Otherwise, it can be devastating and dangerous. And so that's really why I want to talk about this today, because over the next 3 weeks, we're going to actually look at specific examples, verses that are well overused, misused, misunderstood, misinterpreted, have been for years, and so many people use them the wrong way. And so we're going to look at some of those and talk about what they really do mean. But initially, we had talked about just doing that 4 weeks in a row, but today I just felt this burden. Like I really needed to talk about the why this matters and what we're really up against. And it's not just it matters because these things can happen, but because there is something taking place behind the scenes that if we're not aware of, and we can remain ignorant, we can remain in disbelief, but if we're not aware, then we are setting ourselves up. We are making ourselves vulnerable. And so I want us to look at John's gospel. It's one of, it's loved by many. You talk about a bunch of verses that get taken and used. There's some of our favorite verses in the Gospel of John. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. That's in there. It's one of our favorites. We love that one. We like what it says. We'll take that one. Put that on flags. We'll wave that banner at football games, But then there's another one, found in John chapter 8. It's where we're going to be just briefly today. But it's found in John chapter 8. And we love this one because Jesus says, then you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. We love that one. It's even quoted in movies that are just kind of, taking a jab and kind of being funny. But politicians love this one. They use this one all the time. Everybody loves this verse. We like this verse. It's all about the truth, We love the truth. We love to talk about the truth. We love to say, but what we don't realize is that within it just so happens that this particular verse, we're not going to study this one today, but it just so happens that this is one of those verses that actually gets misused all the time. And it's because we don't really pay attention to what Jesus is saying here, that right before this, what he says is, if you're my disciples and you hold on to my teaching, then you will know the truth. And the truth will set you free. That's the kind of truth that Jesus is actually talking about. And yet, when people actually use this verse, it really has nothing to do with that kind of truth. That's not what we're talking about. Instead, we apply it to other truths, and we pick and choose the kind of truth that we want to pay attention to and the ones that we like and that we don't like, and we kind of lean into it. Matter of fact, I imagine there are some of you here today, or maybe listening online, some of you here who, when I read this verse that we're going to look at today, as we're kind of setting this up, you're going to have some pushback. I'm going to read this, and you're going to think, are you kidding? Whoa. That's what we're talking about? Seriously? Come on. You can't be serious. I like, some of this stuff. I like some of that. I like what Jesus says over here. I like these verses over here. But, don't tell me I have to believe that. I don't like that part. I would rather just kind of ignore that part, leave it out. I just don't want to pay attention to that part. I'm not buying that. But here's the thing. This is why we're talking about this. Because when it comes to the gospel messages especially, you just can't do that. We're not afforded that right. You see, if there are parts that you like, the easy part, like you're attracted to those parts. I like this part, I like this part, I like these verses, I like what he says here, I'm okay with that. but I'm uncomfortable with this. But here's the thing. If you're okay with some of the easy stuff, some of the things that are easy to understand and easy and palatable, if those things are okay with you, then you and I need to at least be willing to consider embracing the parts that are extremely difficult and hard to understand and to accept and to believe. We need to be willing to do that. Why? Because you can't pick and choose the truth that you want to receive. The truth that Jesus is really talking about here. And so let me kind of set this up, give you a little bit of context. In chapter 8, Jesus is doing what he often did. He's debating with a group of religious leaders. These guys would kind of follow him around. There was always groups of people that were following him around, and they were arguing with Jesus because they didn't like Jesus. They didn't like what he was teaching. They didn't like the response that he would get from the crowds and the regular people. And so they just didn't like him, especially they didn't like what he was saying about himself, that he was the Son of God. They didn't like that. And so they were coming up to him, and one of their primary arguments was that, how could you be the Son of God? How could you be from God? You're not from God because you're from Galilee. Like, there's people who know you, who grew up with you. You're not who you say you are. Aren't you just a guy from Galilee? And of course, Jesus would say, the reason you don't know who I am is because you don't know my Father. You don't know who I am because you don't really know my Father. You say you follow the law, you follow Moses, you follow Abraham, but I'm just telling you, you don't recognize me. This is what Jesus is about to say. You don't recognize who I am because you don't know my Father. You don't really follow God. Of course, they didn't like that. And so they were really going at it back and forth. And then Jesus, in this verse we're about to look at, he really takes the gloves off. I mean, he just gets really ugly. He just lowers the boom. And this is what I want us to see today. Listen to what Jesus says, verse 44. You belong to your Father. The reason you don't recognize me and who I am is because you belong to your Father. The devil. The devil. And you want to carry out your father's desires. The devil. It's like, oh, that's where we're going, right? Really? I mean, surely Jesus didn't really, this was like a figure of speech, right? Like the devil, you know, like he's just kind of talking about this, you know, personified evil. He's just kind of making a point, but can you really go with that based on what Jesus is about to say? Because if this is all you read, it's like, see, that's just a figure of speech, but you can't go there. Jesus doesn't leave room for that interpretation because of the rest of what he's about to say. He goes on to describe this devil. He says, he, as in this very real entity, this personality, he was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and he's the father of lies. See, this is what's interesting. You may have trouble believing that. You may have trouble believing that, but here's what you got to know. Jesus believed it. Jesus himself, the Son of God, believed that there really was the devil, a personified being, an actual, literal being, a spiritual being that exists, that is in the world, that is a part of what is going on behind the scenes. This is what Jesus believed, and there's really no room for interpreting it a different way, because this isn't something he just confirmed here. He confirmed it in other places as well. Jesus believed that there was a very real devil, and that this devil had one primary agenda from the very beginning: murder. The destruction of human lives and everything that we find important and valuable. To destroy it, to kill it, to steal it. That was his ultimate goal. That is his ultimate goal. Jesus is making the point to these people, and that is what Jesus believed. And that his apparently, while he's very real and very powerful, his power is also very limited, because Jesus talks about it in terms of his primary weapon, his primary mode of operation is deception, lies, manipulation, distortion. In other words, subtly twisting the truth. Not obvious, not apparent. It's not a red guy, with a pitchfork and a long bifurcated tail. Like, that's not the devil. That the devil comes much more discreetly and more pleasingly and palatable than that. And instead, it's just a subtle twisting of the truth, with the goal being to set us off course, to send us in the wrong direction, to maybe even present truth, but just a little bit of it, just enough of it that it looks like truth, but really it's to confuse the human mind. That's his mode of operation. That's his goal, to confuse our mind so that we actually begin to believe that what is right is wrong and that what is wrong is actually right. It's what Jesus believed. Well, then years later, the Apostle Paul would write about the very same thing, something very similar, because he believed it as well. Like Jesus, Paul was dead set that there is something that is happening outside of the physical world, outside of what we can see and touch, that there is a very real, invisible world that is impacting our visible world. And you can choose not to believe it, but you are being affected by it nonetheless, and you're a part of it. And so he encourages the Ephesians. This is one of the places where he talks about this. And so at the end of his letter to the Christians in Ephesus, he's writing to them and he's encouraging them. Don't forget, let me remind you of this. Remember how important this is. And this is our reminder today as well. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand. For Paul, there was something very real happening here. There was a reality that you can't see, you can't touch, but that you can experience. You can choose to ignore it, but you're a part of it nonetheless. And so don't lean into your own might, your own power, your own understanding, your own abilities, your own strength. Lean into God's strength. You've got to do this. This is what Paul is encouraging us, because there is something that is happening all around you. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not aware of it, you're going to be deceived. You're going to be deceived. Because he was very convinced that what we've got to take a stand against is the devil's schemes. Because for Paul, it was a reality. There really was, like Jesus, Paul believed there was a very real, very powerful devil, Satan, Lucifer. And that he also had schemes. In other words, these are premeditated plans and ideas, schemes about how to manipulate and to deceive you and me. This is what Satan is up to all the time. This is his goal. Remember, his agenda is to destroy human life. Like he is a thief. He is a manipulator. He is a deceiver. And his goal is to destroy you and me, to devour you and me. In any way possible, in the way that we think, in the way that we perceive, in the way that we see truth, in the way that we relate to one another, in the way that we communicate, in the way that we handle our finances, in the way that we practice our faith, all of those things. Those are the areas, all of the areas of our lives where Satan is at work, just wanting to subtly twist what is true. I don't want you to think I'm real. I just don't want you to believe all of the truth, because it neutralizes us and it makes us ineffective. And so he reminds us that our struggle's not against flesh and blood, you've heard this before, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. That there is a very, very real devil and a very real, not flesh and blood, but spiritual battle that is taking place. And if we ignore it, we make ourselves vulnerable. If we choose not to believe it, that's okay, but you become vulnerable. You see, there is a very real spiritual battle against a very real invisible enemy. This is the reason I wanted to talk about this today, because this is what we believe. This is what is happening around us, which is what makes this idea of scriptural context and reading the Bible and understanding verses and pieces of verses within its context. No, it's not everything that matters, and it's not like you've got to be a theologian and you've got to know how to, parse Greek verbs. That's not what we're talking about. It just means an awareness that there is something out there that is happening around you, very much as much a reality as the seats that you're sitting in, a reality that is impacting your physical world. And if our eyes aren't open, and if we're not paying attention, if we're unaware, we will be deceived. We will. We'll be manipulated, and we will walk away, and that's all he wants, is to either walk away into doubt or to just be ineffective altogether, to neutralize